Cheers, Rockets fans. Welcome to The Locker Line, an exclusive podcast from the home of the Rockets.
Whoa!
Sports Talk 790.
Rockets!
The Locker Line is proudly served to you by Carbox Clutch City Lager.
It is good!
Oh, yeah? Red Nation, get ready. Get ready. The Locker Line starts now.
Welcome aboard.
Welcome in to another emergency episode of The Lager Line, as always served to you courtesy of Houston's Carbox Brewing. I'm Ben Dubose, your host, editor of USA Today's Rockets Wire, a contributor to Sports Talk 790, official flagship radio station of your Houston Rockets. We're chatting on Monday, June 30th. It's the start of free agency all around the NBA, so we may have a full show later tonight, maybe in the days ahead, reacting to any news on the Rockets front. As we talked about in the last pod, with Fred VanVleet restructuring his deal to $25 million in salary next season rather than $45, which was the team option on his previous deal, the Rockets now have more money to play with in free agency, potentially up to the non-taxpayer mid-level exception, which allows them to spend up to $14 million in annual value in free agency on a player such as Dorian Finney-Smith of the Lakers. That's reportedly a target. I do believe there's something there on that front. We'll see if the deal happens quickly once free agency opens at 5 p.m. Central tonight. We'll talk more about that in the back half of this pod and also in future pods as we get concrete intel about whether Dorian Finney-Smith or anyone else in free agency will be joining the Rockets. Certainly someone will. The question is simply who it's going to be and what role they're going to have. I'm told the Rockets are really prioritizing trying to backfill those Dillon Brooks minutes with someone who, like Dillon, can shoot capably, but more importantly, is a very strong and versatile defender that not only gives you wing defense, but also the ability to scale up and guard some bigs, the way we saw Dillon do against players such as Victor Wembanyama at times. So Dorian Finney-Smith, who I think had the best plus-minus rating of any Lakers player last year. They improved so much when he was on the floor, picked him up mid-season. He's a target. I think he'll be one of the first calls the Rockets make once negotiations can officially, wink, wink, begin at 5 p.m. this afternoon. We'll see if it gets to the finish line. I'm sure other teams are going to be in the bidding, other contenders. Shams Charania of ESPN reported would be in the mix. The Lakers still have some hope of potentially retaining him. So it's not a given, but I think it speaks to the types of players the Rockets will be going after, and we'll see which one gets to the finish line and ultimately joins a Rockets rotation that is going to be at least 9 deep of very quality players. We know the starters are most likely going to be Fred VanVleet, Amen Thompson, Kevin Durant, Jabari Smith Jr., and Alperen Sengun. Your bench is going to be Tari Eason, Steven Adams, either Reed Shepherd or Aaron Holiday as your backup point guard. Hopefully Reed Shepherd. By the way, the Rockets are bringing back Aaron Holiday along with Jeff Green and Jae'Sean Tate. We'll get to that before this minicast episode concludes as well. And now whoever you sign with this non-taxpayer mid-level exception, or at least a decent chunk of it, will end up being the 9th man in your rotation. And does that lead to the Rockets trading Cam Whitmore? Possibly. We talked about that on last week's pod. Going into year 3, he needs to play. And if you bring in someone that's clearly ahead of him in the hierarchy, which a Dorian Finney-Smith would be, it doesn't make sense to have Cam Whitmore at 10th or lower in the pecking order, so to speak, because with him up for an extension as soon as next offseason, you need to figure out, and when I say you, I mean the team that has Cam on their books this season, what you have in him so that you can start projecting out the future value. And if the Rockets are deep enough as is and trying to contend, and you're already going to be trying to fit in more minutes for a young guy in Reed Shepherd, it could be difficult to bring in 2 entirely new rotation guys from the standpoint of not in your rotation or any rotation for that matter. So it could just be a numbers game, Cam getting squeezed out. We talked about it in the last pod. Since then, it's been reported by a couple of sources, most notably Kelly Iko of The Athletic, that trade talks are ongoing. His situation is described as fluid. And if the Rockets bring in a proven difference maker such as Dorian Finney-Smith, my personal opinion is that it makes it more likely that ultimately the Rockets move on from Cam. Don't want to talk too much about that situation today because, again, we covered that in the last pod. So there's a few things to update you guys on as far as developments in recent days and leading up to the start of free agency negotiations tonight. But the big news that I want to spend the majority of this pod discussing is the Jabari Smith Jr. extension, which leaked Sunday night. 5 years, $122 million, according to Kelly Eco, no player or team options. As I see it, this is just a total game changer for the future of this franchise. We've talked about how in future years, the payroll is going to get really tight. When we talk about bumping up against the first apron, potentially the second apron, and the repeater tax to get Jabari Smith through the 2030 to 31 season on a deal at below $25 million in average annual value. I am very surprised by this. And I think it's something that not just because of the player Jabari is, but just the entire puzzle and how it all fits together. This is a deal that is going to make life a lot easier for the Rockets in future years. I was not expecting it to come in at this rate. Quite frankly, it wouldn't have surprised me if Jabari didn't do an extension at all because his year 3 was very unique. We know he missed a lot of time because of the hand fracture. Then he came back and came off the bench because they weren't going to remove Amen Thompson from the starting lineup. He didn't play a ton in the playoffs for various reasons. And so it wouldn't have surprised me between the disjointed year 3 and Jabari at 22 being one of the youngest guys in his entire draft class if nothing got done this offseason. And Jabari's camp basically said, yeah, we'll wait a year and have a little bit better understanding of what his market would actually be. But he wanted to get this deal done, apparently, and I'm certainly not going to judge him. Financial security matters. I always think it's so silly when people who have no knowledge of an individual player's personal situation make judgments. This is a cross-sport analogy, but you often hear on the Astros side, folks asking, why did Yordan Alvarez take an extension for 6 years, $115 million? Well, when it's your first big contract and you don't have anywhere near that level of financial security in the bank, it's real easy to say, yeah, just wait it out and you'll get paid way more than that when there's not much in that bank account. Now, I'm speaking relatively here. Obviously, even minimum salaries in sports are still pretty good. But the point is, when you haven't gotten that first big contract, to say, oh, just wait another year or two and you'll get way more money. It's easy to say that when it's not your money and you're on the outside. So first things first, nobody should judge Jabari for taking this 5-year deal. I am a little bit surprised by it in terms of where he's at in his career and what I think his value might have been if he had waited it out. But you certainly shouldn't judge it by any means. Everybody's situation is different. He's going to get paid very well. Obviously, Texas does not have a state income tax, so that potentially helps as well. Just looking at it from a team perspective, that's why I'm expressing a little bit of surprise. It's not saying that Jabari or his agent did a bad job by any means. It's just, in terms of surprise, it's the implications on the future of the Rockets and the team building. And for me, first off, below $25 million in average annual value under the new collective bargaining agreement of the NBA. Folks, this is a steal. By the end of his deal, the MLE is going to be just below $20 million in that final season, 2030 to 31. So the average annual value of this deal, which is about $24 million, is barely above the MLE by the end of it. We can question Jabari's ceiling, and we know the debates that have been had on social media and message boards nonstop because he's not the shiftiest guy. He's not a huge creator. So does he have star upside, even though he was drafted at number 3 overall in 2022? Yeah, we can have those discussions. But one thing I think we can all agree on is that he has a very high floor between the 6'11" frame, being able to defend multiple positions, a capable three-point shot. Worst case, he's a solid, versatile 3-and-D type player who has a great attitude. Danielle Lerner of the Chronicle reported in her Jabari extension story that people around the organization were very impressed by how Jabari handled the so-called benching last year, which, given his pedigree, given that it's not like the team was playing poorly when he started, it would have been very easy for him to pout. That didn't happen. So worst case, you're looking at a guy with a ton of length, that profiles very well as a 3-and-D piece that can contribute to winning. And there's upside for him to be more than that, and perhaps working with Kevin Durant can help that even more. But even if just the high floor hits and the concern that's been there all along as far as how high is Jabari's ceiling, even if we're just talking about the floor hitting, when the contract is just above the mid-level exception and the floor is as high as it is with Jabari, and there are no character concerns, quite frankly, it's the opposite. If anything, his character is a bonus. It really adds to his value because he's such a good teammate and he's willing to do all the little things and that he helps build the right culture. A deal above the MLE for 5 years, barely above the MLE, I mean, it's a steal. And so from a team building perspective, it's a game changer. It gives the Rockets a lot more breathing room for the bigger deals that are coming down the pike. Obviously, Kevin Durant is going to get an extension likely by the end of this offseason. We know by 2 years from now, Amen Thompson is almost certainly going to be on a max deal. And so to get a full 5-year deal, the same way the Rockets did with Alperen Şengün, to lock them in on a sub-max deal for as long as possible. And of course, with Jabari, it's far below the max. With Şengün, it's a little bit below the max. But the point is to get that stability for the longest time period possible. 5 years is the longest deal that you can give out under the current NBA CBA. It's a win. And for me, it helps with team building. And I also think that it sort of closes the loop on the Kevin Durant trade, which I think is really important because, look, in terms of the next 2 to 3 years of this franchise, it's the KD trade that's going to be the biggest thing that happened this offseason. Because if you actually win a championship or get anywhere close, it's going to be because Kevin Durant comes in and does his job as the A1, the alpha scorer that takes this team to the next level. That's been the clear deficiency for months, for years. We've talked about it ad nauseum, and you finally swung the big deal for a star level player. And so not only does this Jabari contract help from the standpoint of having, worst case, a very good role player on a friendly contract. And by the way, I've seen some people saying, does this make him more of a trade piece because there's all this certainty? In theory, it could, but I would actually go the other way, the other direction. I would say it makes him less likely to be traded because the deal is so friendly to the team. It's exactly what a franchise like the Rockets is going to need as their roster gets more expensive. You need a guy like that that's on a very team-friendly deal to be one of your key rotation players to make sure that the finances work and that you're not getting into salary cap hell or second apron hell, whatever you want to call it these days. So in theory, yes, he could be a trade piece, and I'm sure that deal is going to be desirable. But I would actually go the other direction. I would argue that it makes him less likely to be traded because on this type of deal, he's going to be very valuable to the Rockets. And who knows, maybe the KD talks helped leverage Jabari into taking this deal, and that, you know, if he really wanted to be in Houston long term, then taking a deal like this made it more likely for the Rockets to want to keep him. And I'm sure Jabari and his agent knew that. Perhaps that's an angle. I haven't been told that. That's just me speculating. But to keep it going with the KD trade connection, that's where I think this really takes the whole offseason full circle. And I think it really illustrates why the Rockets made the best deal that they reasonably could to bring in Kevin Durant, which, as mentioned, if you win a championship, that's probably going to be the biggest reason why. And we know the Rockets are in full-on championship contention mode right now. This is a win-now team, and whatever they do in free agency, which starts later tonight, I think that will largely reflect that. So, in terms of the KD trade, we talked about it really since the start of June, in that if the price was right, if the market was low enough, and KD turns 37 in September, and we know the circumstances of his contract entering the final year, Phoenix didn't have a lot of leverage, yet the Rockets had to send out something in the ballpark of $50 million in outgoing salary for the deal to work under the CBA. So part of that was going to be veterans, in that either Jalen Brooks or Jock Landale and Aaron Holiday, some combination of your expirings, but you were going to have to give something in the ballpark of $15 to $20 million in basically veteran filler salaries. And I think the Suns probably negotiated for it to be Dillon, who's certainly a better player than Holiday and Landale, but they had the leverage to do that, especially if they're not getting a haul in terms of young assets. And if you're the Rockets, you can't let Dillon Brooks, as we talked about in recent pods, be the difference in why you get or don't get Kevin Durant. Dillon Brooks is a nice player, but he's potentially replaceable, perhaps by Dorian Finney-Smith later tonight. Time will tell. The other parts of the deal, well, beyond the veteran filler salaries, we also knew the number 10 pick in 2025 was highly likely to be in it because there just was no way to develop that player in Houston. And it was the pick that previously belonged to the Suns. So for multiple reasons, we knew the number 10 pick would be in the deal, and we knew there'd be some combination of veteran filler salaries. We had hoped that it would be Jock Landale and Aaron Holiday because they're less essential to the Rockets than Dillon Brooks was. But again, at the end of the day, you can't walk away over Dillon Brooks. He's a nice player, but he's replaceable, especially on a contender where, we're seeing all the time the Rockets are getting these friendly contracts in large part because they are a contender. And when you're a contender, players want to be here. So unlike 2023, when the Rockets had to overpay guys like Fred and Dillon to bring them in to a situation where the Rockets were coming off a last place finish, there were all these culture questions. Now people want to be in Houston, and you're seeing the opposite. You can get guys on friendly deals, and that makes it all the more reasonable to replace someone like Dillon Brooks without having a ton of financial resources. And so I think that went into the trade as well. But the point is, you had the veteran filler salaries, you had the number 10 pick, and then you were going to have to give, both for salary reasons, but more importantly, asset reasons, you're going to have to give something of value from your young core to the Phoenix Suns. It wasn't going to be Amen Thompson or Alperen Sengun, who are already all-star level players. That's just not realistic for a guy who's about to turn 37 in the last year of his contract. They were off limits. And then your younger guys, a combination of how young and unproven they are, and also their contractual status not quite making as much money because they're younger, it didn't really make sense for them to be the piece. Jalen and Jabari were always the most likely candidates because they're in that in-between range. They make enough money and they've proven enough to where they can check multiple boxes, both salary value and asset value to the Suns. And yet they weren't so good to the Rockets that it just made no sense to do the deal, as would have been the case with Amen Thompson and Alperen Sengun. It just didn't make sense to trade one of them for a soon-to-be 37-year-old Kevin Durant. So Jalen and Jabari were always the sweet spots, and the Rockets successfully negotiated, led by GM Rafael Stone, to where they wouldn't have to give up both. So it came down to which of the two. And certainly some of it comes down to roster considerations. I've been told that the Rockets view Kevin Durant primarily as a shooting guard, even though he's 6'11", he operates as a scorer. That's why they think the Suns underachieved last year. They viewed Phoenix as basically having their three most important players all being shooting guards between Devin Booker, Kevin Durant, and Bradley Beal. And obviously that's not a good mix. And so not only does Kevin Durant replace Jalen Green as the A1, the top perimeter scorer, but as the Rockets view it, he also basically replaces him as the shooting guard. So there was something of an overlap between KD and Jalen Green. I think Houston views the fit as a little more seamless, sending out Jalen and keeping Jabari. Even though Kevin is a forward in name, I don't think that's how the Rockets view it in terms of their roster and how all these pieces fit together. But more importantly than that, because Kevin is 37, and be it this year, a year from now, 2 years from now, there is eventually going to be a decline. The other factor that I think led the Rockets to include Jalen rather than Jabari, both for salary reasons and asset reasons, it comes down to the long-term value. And that's where these contracts come into play. There were arguments you could make on both sides. Jabari has a higher floor than Jalen, and we've talked about it in the past. We all know why. Because of the 6'11", long, lanky three-point shooter that can defend, because of that archetype, he's always going to give you some value as a defender, as a connector, as opposed to Jalen as the tip of the spear scorer. He really needs to hit at a high level. And if he doesn't have that baseline in terms of his defense, his playmaking to still give you a ton of value. So the argument at a high level comes down to Jalen is higher ceiling, but Jabari is higher floor. And how do you sort of balance that long term when the Rockets have this core seven, or did have this core seven of young prospects drafted in the first round of the last 4 draft classes? And, some have higher ceilings, some have higher floors. You also have your veterans. It was Fred, Dylan, and Steven Adams. Now it's Fred, KD, and Steven Adams. So do you want the higher floor? Do you want the higher ceiling? How does it all come together? And there's arguments you can make on both sides of the fence there. And I'm not going to say you're wrong if you wanted to keep the upside of Jalen, who we know he struggled in the playoffs. But look, the last 60 games of the regular season, excluding those final 3, which were just cardio on a team that had nothing to play for at all, he averaged just under 23 points, 5 rebounds, 4 assists per game, 44% shooting, 37% on threes, 56% true shooting, actually a little bit above all of those numbers. There's an argument that Jalen can still be a very good player in this league. And he was a good player last year. In fact, he was the top scorer on the number 2 seed in the West. So I really don't like this revisionist history looking only at the playoffs and saying addition by subtraction with the Rockets getting rid of Jalen Green. No, that's not fair. It's a coping mechanism to sort of make fans feel as good about the deal as possible. Look, you can feel good about the deal simply because it's Kevin freaking Durant. You don't have to throw Jalen Green under the bus to justify it. The playoffs were disappointing, but by and large, he's just 23 years old. He had a good season. Let's not act like he was a bad basketball player. There were certainly arguments you could make, and I made a few of them in recent pods, in favor of keeping Jalen and sending out Jabari. However, I think this contract makes it clear that the Rockets made the right decision in prioritizing Jabari. And Shams Charania of ESPN, in his story about the Jabari extension, mentioned that the Rockets consistently kept Jabari out of the Durant talks, made it clear that he was a part of the long-term core in Houston. A lot of it just comes down to the money, because when you're projecting future value, it's all relative to the price. And Jalen, when he did his extension last year, 2 years and the player option, his average annual value is about 35, and he'll be up for a new deal as soon as 2 years from now, which is after the first year of the new Jabari contract, which starts with the 26 to 27 season. So Jabari's deal, average annual value in the low 20s, $23, $24 million. Jalen in the mid 30s, and he'll be up for a new deal far sooner. And so when we talk about projecting the future, for starters, if Jalen, let's say he doesn't improve anymore, or maybe he regresses a little bit, well, you're not going to regret trading him in that scenario because he's just not good at basketball. It resolves itself if all the concerns about Jalen's floor not being particularly high end up panning out, and he's just not the guy that we hoped he'd be. Well, you're certainly not going to regret trading him in that world because he's just not good. But even if, let's say, Jalen just stays where he is, improves a little bit, just modest bumps across the board, he's at least going to stay in the ballpark of where he is today, which is mid-30s average annual value. We know his archetype, a top scorer, is going to get paid simply based on the counting stats. And he might even get something closer to $40 million, because Jalen basically, by doing the 2 to 3 year deal with the player option after the second year, Jalen basically bet on himself. That was well chronicled at the time, that he can get more money long-term with this structure as opposed to doing the traditional 4 or 5 year deal, something close to the max, if not in money, certainly in years. No, he bet on himself, and that's his prerogative. Like, I'm not going to judge the guy because financially it could be better for him this way. I'm just simply speaking from a team perspective. And if he improves a little bit, or even just stays where he is, I think average annual value is certainly going to stay in the ballpark of what his current deal is, which is about $35 million annually, if not improve a little bit. And it's possible that it goes up into the 40s. So we're talking about a huge delta, somewhere in the range of $12 to $20 million annually in the expected future value of the Jalen Green and Jabari Smith Jr. contracts. Yeah, getting Jabari on a 5 year deal That's where this becomes so important in the big picture because of the stability to your future projections. It's not sexy to say that, but in the modern NBA, with how punitive these second apron and luxury tax restrictions are, the certainty of those future projections, and that's something we didn't know on the outside. It's important to remember that. We're trying to analyze and read the tea leaves based on the information that we have, but the Rockets inherently have more information than we do. That doesn't mean they're always going to be right. It doesn't mean you can't second guess or criticize them, but you should at least keep it in the back of your mind that, hey, they know some things that we don't. And in these negotiations, I think they knew, and perhaps they used them as a leverage point, but that's just me speculating, what Jabari's next deal would come in at. And so when you're comparing Jabari at low 20s average annual value to Jalen Green next couple of years in the mid 30s and beyond that, likely to be the same or even higher. The only world where he wouldn't be higher is if he underachieves. And in that scenario, if, he regresses or doesn't show much growth at all, then you wouldn't be regretting trading him because he's just not helping you win games, period. So knowing Jabari's future value, that's what made him such a important hold piece to the Rockets, someone that they wanted to retain. Certainly he's a good player, but also the contract, how it helps your future optionality, how all these pieces fit together. That's what this deal does for the Rockets beyond just the basketball merits of his play. As opposed to Jalen, as I see it, the only scenario where you would really lose out is if Jalen Green legitimately becomes an all-NBA level player, like top 15, top 10 in the league good. And while that's not impossible, look, he is 23 years old now. He's been in the league 4 seasons. We've seen his first playoff run. I'm not going to say it's impossible, but I do think even the biggest Jalen optimist out there would have to concede that that outcome is becoming unlikely, and certainly more unlikely than it was a year or two ago. Those super high-end outcomes are just probably not going to pan out. He's a good but flawed player. And unless he hits at a true star level, not just star, let's say all-NBA star, then you'd rather Jabari in the context of a team that already has a lot of high-end talent at other positions. You would rather that Jabari contract, which is much easier to build a team around, than Jalen being at what certainly the next 2 years are going to be on the extension. He did not give back nearly as much as Jabari, but also the years beyond that and what the next contract is going to look like. The only reason you would regret not having Jalen Green is if he becomes one of those guys where even if he's being paid $40, $50 million a year, he's underpaid because he is just that damn good. In my opinion, that is unlikely for Jalen. It's not impossible, but it's one of those, if Jalen becomes that level of player, you just sort of tip your hat and say, wow, this stings, but it is what it is. And, hindsight's 2020, but it's impossible at the time, based on what we know now, to see that as a reasonable outcome for Jalen. I'm not down on him. I think he works hard. I think he'll be a quality player, but I don't think that all-NBA level is where he's going to end up. And that's the only scenario at this point where I think you would regret sending Jalen and not Jabari. So with this contract, I think it really closes the book on the KD trade and why he was the piece that was most expendable from a Houston perspective in terms of, the 10 was in it. You're going to have to give some veteran salaries. It became Dylan Brooks. But if you're comparing Jabari on this deal to Jalen on his and the uncertainty of the future deal, because Jalen went so short term, and again, I understand why. Jalen's situation is pretty unique too, and that's why I think he wanted that player option after year 2. It would not have surprised me if Jabari did the same thing, or maybe Jabari didn't even seriously engage in extension talks this offseason at all. Maybe he just wanted to wait until 2026 restricted free agency. But the difference in the way those two players handled those negotiations and projecting out the future payrolls of this team, at the time I said it was a reasonable debate in terms of should you send Jalen, should you send Jabari? But knowing the finances like we know them now, I'm strongly on the side of the Rockets made the right decision. The only way you can argue against the KD trade at this point is to say you shouldn't have done it at all, and that we shouldn't have had this debate of, is it Jalen or is it Jabari as the primary young asset going to the Suns? But I don't find that realistic because, look, you were 52-30 last year, number 2 in the West. and you're bringing in an all-star level player who addresses your biggest need, who still goes out, even at 36 years old, and put up over 26 points per game on 50-40-90 shooting splits, better than 50-40-90 shooting splits. I don't think if the price is low enough to where you're only giving up one certain young asset from that core of young players, and not even one of your better ones, not a Min Thompson, not Alperen Şengün. If the price is that low and the player comes in, addresses your biggest need on a team that was already 52-30, number 2 in the West, and inherently not far from the contending window actually being open, I don't think you can argue against the trade when the price point is that low. To me, it makes all the sense in the world, and I've said it in the past, for the Rockets to be interested in Kevin Durant. It just comes down to what does the deal look like, and now having this information about what the Jabari contract, the next one that is, looks like, to me, it's pretty clear that the Rockets made the right decision. And then as far as other topics as we wind down the pod, so free agency starts tonight. Negotiations can officially begin at 5 p.m. Central. The one name that's been reported on the market, and I've heard this as well, is Dorian Finney-Smith, who turned down his player option with the Lakers. He could be a target for close to, if not all of, the non-taxpayer mid-level exception that the Rockets have access to because of Fred VanVleet renegotiating his contract, taking a pay cut next year, a pretty significant one relative to the team option figure. I think the Rockets will certainly pursue Dorian, and it's important to remember he played most of his career with the Dallas Mavericks. So some people are undoubtedly going to say, well, would he leave Luka and LeBron? Would he leave the limelight of the Lakers? No, this is a guy who's played most of his career in Texas. I believe he played his college ball at Florida. So he's a Southern guy. He's not the typical LA player that wants that type of market or that stage. I think Tim McMahon of ESPN reported that his wife and kids still live in Dallas, and obviously Houston is far closer than LA is. So in terms of both contention, but also lifestyle, the Rockets could be a fit for him. And in terms of why he's a fit for the Rockets, the simplest explanation, just look at the Lakers' net ratings, the on-off, after they traded for him from the Nets midway through last season. He had the biggest differential on the entire team, the three-point shooting, the defense. And as I mentioned leading off the pod, for the Rockets, you can't let Dillon Brooks be the reason you don't get Kevin Durant. Yet at the same time, there are a lot of valuable things that Dillon Brooks gave you. Certainly the three-point shooting, but also the defense and the versatility of it, being able to scale up and guard bigger players. Because even though KD is 6'11" and people call him a forward, he's basically a guard, and he's very light. So the ability to have a wing that can scale up in terms of who he guards, the way we saw Dillon do against Wemby, that's very valuable to the Rockets, and that's where Dorian Finney-Smith can really be useful. He's 32 years old, so it's not a sexy signing. There's not a ton of upside, but it's also not like he's close to being over the hill either. He's just a solid role player. I don't think the Rockets are that worried about, I've seen some talk on social media, oh, it's another forward. Do they need a guard? Well, as mentioned, the Rockets view Kevin Durant largely as a guard. But beyond that, what I've heard inside the building at Toyota Center, the Rockets want to get bigger. That's a point of emphasis for them this offseason. They say last year, if you look at their data, they were at their best when it was one guard, either Fred or Jalen, surrounded by some combination of Amen, Dillon, Jabari, Tari, and a center. We've talked about double big, and certainly in the playoffs with Steven and Alpi playing together, but they were better as a big team overall. And I think you'll probably see more of that this year. And it's not like when we put these forwards in bunches, it's important to remember Kevin Durant might be listed as a forward, but they view him largely as a shooting guard. Also, Amen Thompson was drafted as a potential point guard of the future, so he has some ball handling, some creation ability. So it's not like these are your, or at least all of them, boxy forwards that can't create in the perimeter. But just generally speaking, the Rockets want more length. They want more size. They want to be able to have long arms, play the passing lanes, defend multiple positions, crash the glass. They want to be bigger. And so for them, being able to replace the size and physicality of Dillon Brooks on the wing, but collectively just throwing another body into that wing mix. That's what they want. They are not looking at themselves as having some sort of guard deficiency. They think, Fred VanVleet should be a very good player. They do trust Reed Shepherd. He's going to play more this coming season. And they view Kevin Durant as a guard. And they want Amen Thompson to get more on-ball creation reps. I don't think they view themselves as having a guard deficiency. But beyond that, I don't think that just the way they're putting this team together, that they necessarily want more rim pressure, the way I've seen some fans characterize it on social media. No, I think they want more size. They want to backfill Dillon's role on last year's team. And that's where someone like a Dorian Finney-Smith can be really useful. And if he's not available, I'm sure there's backup targets. I'm sure we'll find out about them. But that's the way the Rockets are looking at this. They want to get bigger. That's what Dorian Finney-Smith can provide. They want to get back some of what they lost with Dillon, which, again, they're not regretting it. You don't let Dillon Brooks be the reason you don't get Kevin Durant. Yet at the same time, you can be honest and say, hey, this guy really contributed to winning. Is there a way we can replace this? As I've said a few times, and you guys are probably sick of this analogy, but for 50% of the cost, give someone that gives you, 80% of what Dillon gave you. And I think that's kind of what you'd be looking at with Dorian Finney-Smith. Just a solid vet that can come in, do many of the same things, and plays into, again, I think the way the Rockets are looking at this, bigger is better. And that's why they're not really prioritizing a guard for the sake of, backfilling a role. No, they view Kevin Durant as their shooting guard. They like Jabari Smith sliding in so that they have even more length, more size in that starting lineup. And I think Dorian Finney-Smith fits perfectly into what we're seeing they envision as the blueprint of this team. Now, maybe it doesn't work as well as they think or we think. And if that's the case, then, as long as the contracts are reasonable value, then you have future optionality to make trades as the deadline gets closer. As long as the deals are good in value, then certainly you should have options down the line. But for now, this is the emphasis, and it makes sense to me. All right, last angle that I want to get to before we close out the pod, and I'll be quick on this because nobody wants to spend a ton of time looking at Jae'Sean Tate, Aaron Holiday, and Jeff Green, three guys who most likely are going to be 10th, 11th, 12th men off your bench, not consistent rotation players. But these are good veterans. And for the Rockets to sign all of them, likely to minimum deals, that hasn't been confirmed. I think the closest thing to confirmation, we heard Kelly Iko of The Athletic report that Jae'Sean Tate would be taking at or near the minimum. He made nearly $7 million last year. I think with Jeff Green, it's not a shock to see him at the minimum because he's 38 years old, year 19. His situation is unique. But Aaron Holiday and Jae'Sean Tate were contributors to winning last year for the number 2 team in the West, and neither of them is even 30 years old. And so to get them at near the minimum, the reason I don't think it's been confirmed, now with Tate, Kelly came close to confirming it. With Aaron Holiday, as of midday Monday, that same level of confirmation isn't out there. But what we do know is that the Rockets turned down his team option, which is $4.9 million. So inherently, it's going to be less than that. And the minimum for players of their experience level is about $3 million. So just read the tea leaves. If they turn down the $4.9 million team option, inherently, so that it's better for the team, then it's probably going to be the minimum or very close. The reason I don't think it's been specifically reported is that the Rockets are going to see exactly where the payroll comes in at after whoever they sign in free agency. And if they have a little bit more money in that they don't spend all of the non-tax-free available exception, or they're not all the way at the luxury tax line or the first apron or whatever threshold we're talking about, if they have a little bit of extra money, I'm sure they've let it be known to those players and their agents that they'll take care of them. But it just depends on exactly what the payroll looks like after this initial wave of free agency and whoever they sign for that rotation spot. And so I think the reason the deals haven't been confirmed, it's sort of an understanding that we'll try to get you a little bit more than the minimum, but if all we have left is the minimum, are you okay with taking that? And they've clearly given a nod to say that it is. And so I think certainly it speaks well to the environment inside the building, and that, Rafael Stone as GM, Ime Udoka as head coach, they built up a lot of trust. They prioritize relationships, and that's panning out. But I also think that, look, these are players, when you talk about quasi-rotation guys who aren't even 30, in the case of Aaron and Jae'Sean, who stay for at or near the minimum, that reflects the culture that's been built. And again, I think it plays into some of the other moves that they've made this offseason, and that now it sort of confirms that the Rockets are one of those franchises where players want to be there. And so because of that, it gives you more options than we're used to when it comes to filling out the rotation and filling out the end of your bench. And so, yeah, it could make a guy like Dillon Brooks a bit more expendable because the Rockets know they're going to be desirable enough that, hey, you can backfill this even if you don't have a ton of financial resources to do so. That's what being able to keep, and it's all relative. I understand when we're talking about Jason Tate and Aaron Holiday, this is not a sexy discussion. We're talking about guys who may be the 10th, 11th, 12th man on your bench going into the season and just depth pieces in case of injuries or back-to-back maintenance considerations, whatever happens over the grind of 82 games. But I do think on a very small scale, this illustrates the broader trend, which is that the Rockets have built something that players want to be a part of, that is really respected around the league. People want to be in Houston. And so because of that, it opens up opportunities that, quite frankly, we're not used to seeing in recent seasons. And so you shouldn't have a parade in the streets because you kept Jason Tate and Aaron Holiday even at the minimum. I'm not saying anything crazy like that. But I do think, and me personally, like I was expecting Aaron Holiday to be gone if the Rockets didn't pick up the team option, because he's a solid defender, one of their better ones at the point of attack, and he shot nearly 40% on threes the last 2 years. He is better, far better, than most players who sign at the minimum. So my outlook going into the offseason was that if you wanted to keep him, it would be on that $4.9 million team option. To get him on a near minimum or a true minimum deal, it just speaks to the extent to which players want to be in Houston. And that's a really good place to be. Again, you shouldn't go crazy. It's not like you're going to win a championship in all likelihood because guys like Aaron or Jason are here. They're just good vets near the end of your bench. But beyond what they do individually, I think it illustrates the broader trend, which is that players see what's been built. They really respect what Houston is doing. And so because of that, it opens up possibilities as you build out your roster that you wouldn't necessarily think you had going into the offseason. And that makes it all the more likely to make a big trade like what the Rockets did for Kevin Durant, because even if you give up some pieces that are, useful, but not true top of the line guys, well, one of the benefits of being a really good team that players want to be a part of is that those guys that are good but replaceable, you're in a much better position to find those subsequent replacements. And so it makes it easier for you to splurge on the true top-of-the-line, irreplaceable guys like a Kevin Durant, because you are able to backfill what you lose from a depth perspective much more easily. Anyway, that'll do it for today's episode. We should have more content in the days ahead. As mentioned, whether the Rockets sign Dorian Finney-Smith or someone else, I do think they're going to bring in a rotation player. There'll be lots to talk about. And I also want to get Paolo Alves, my co-host, I want to get his perspective on the Jabari extension, also the Fred extension, because I did the mini episode myself last week. So I'll bring in Paolo later in the week. We'll react to whoever the Rockets sign or trade for in free agency. We'll talk about the recent extensions for Jabari and Fred. And we'll also look at anything else that happens. It should be a busy couple of weeks. Rockets also getting ready for the Las Vegas Summer League. So they're going to finalize that roster in the next few days. So we'll talk much more Rockets in the days ahead. Certainly the first 2 or 3 weeks of July should have a lot of activity. Also got the Kevin Durant press conference because that deal was not processed in June. They had to wait until July and the higher Jalen Green salary on this 25 to 26 fiscal year. So we'll have reaction to the first Kevin Durant media appearance in Houston. And I'm sure he'll be asked about why he wanted to be a part of the Rockets, the motivating factors that led to him wanting to play here. So there should be a lot more content, a lot more episodes in the next couple of weeks because we have a lot to get to in this busy 2025 Rockets offseason before we finally get to the dead period in the back half of July and going into August and September. But for today, this is where we'll break. And if you want more content before future shows, the best place to get it is on social media. I'm on Blue Sky at Ben Dubose. The show is on Twitter/X at The Loggerline. And then if you go to the link tree in that Loggerline page on X, you can find resources to support friends, sponsors, partners of the program, USA Today's Rockets Wire, Carbach Brewing, Sports Talk 790. Please consume their content. You can also find links to distributors of the program, Apple, Google, Spotify. If you've not already, please subscribe, leave a positive review at your platform of choice. That's how we can keep this show looking good to our sponsors and partners and keep going. It's one of the most active podcasts covering Houston Rockets basketball. All right, with the plugs complete, I'll break it for now. Again, I'm Ben Dubose, editor of USA Today's Rockets Wire. By the way, you can hit up Rockets Wire on X at the Rockets Wire and go to rocketswire.usatoday.com for all your daily Houston Rockets news coverage. So I lied, one last plug, but I promise we're actually done now. Again, I'm Ben Dubose. Thanks as always for listening, and please come back soon for more new episodes of The Logger Line.